I'm delighted, I'm honored, I'm a little intimidated, but here we are, so we'll just step in. I'm excited about the theme of this conference because it seems to me that we really are in a time of global transformation. So I think it's an important time to step back and to reflect a bit on the paradox of persistence and change in education. So I hope my thoughts about the pandemic, which, to be fair, have evolved a bit since I wrote my abstract. So I think I'm going to tell you about more change than I might have expected when I was starting my thinking about this process. I hope my thoughts about how the pandemic is and is not changing education as a global institution can be generative as we work together for the rest of this week to understand this moment and to understand our place in it. Think about how we can effectively intervene. I'm going to take a look at my clock to make sure that I don't hold us up too long. So, it seems to me appropriate, let's watch these flowers. It seems to me appropriate to start a talk thinking about the pandemic and the way it's changed education over the last 3 years with a memory from the pandemic. So as I was working on this talk, I was sort of struck, it was like sort of a sense memory of sitting in my kitchen early one morning, unable to sleep, hunched over my laptop, doom scrolling, as I think many of us were in March and April of 2020. When I sort of stumbled on Twitter into a beautiful essay written by the novelist Arundhati Roy. Writing from Delhi, where she too was in lockdown, Roy provided an elegant pocket history of human pandemics. And she ended with a stirring sort of prediction or maybe a call to action. She wrote, historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and to imagine their world anew. This one, she said, is no different. It's a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. I found this to be a stirring statement, as I say, less a prediction than a call to action. Roy saw the pandemic as an opportunity to imagine a new, more just and equitable world and to bring that world into being. So now, 3 years and some 20 million deaths later, I've been revisiting that essay and I've been asking myself, if the pandemic is a portal, where is it taken us? Or perhaps, because I think when you start to think about it, you realize this story is far from over, where is it taking us? And what is our role as educators, as educational scholars, in helping our communities navigate these changes? So to answer that question, I'm going to tell you 3 stories about the pandemic. The first riffs, I think, on Arundhati Roy's call to action. I'm going to tell you about the pandemic as a portal. I'm going to look back over the pandemic as an educational phenomena, and I'm going to provide some thoughts about the ways the pandemic has created the conditions for really serious institution-level, structural change in education. Then I'm going to draw on theory, mostly from the sociology of education, which is my field, to put some boundaries on how we might expect those changes to proceed. Because this theory in the sociology of education talks a lot about stasis, talks a lot more about persistence than it does about change, I'm calling this section of the talk, the pandemic is a pothole. And then finally, I'm going to try to bring together some ideas. I'm going to try to look forward and put forward an idea that the pandemic, it feels to me, is that we're a little bit like billiard balls in this sort of post-pandemic world, once sort of clustered together in practices that were common across the institution of education, and the pandemic came along kind of like a pool cue and has scattered us. And I'm going to talk about a few places where I see that scattering happening, and provide a few thoughts, although I'm going to get a little bit out of my comfort zone while I do so, provide a few thoughts about what I think that might mean for us as educators and educator scholars, how we can envision our role moving forward. So before I do those 3 talks, I think I'd just say a few minutes, just spend a second telling you a little bit about myself and my position, my positionality. So my perspective is distinctly American. I lived the pandemic really in a little uninsulated shed in my backyard while my children in Durham, North Carolina, where my children were in remote school in the house. And just even though it was cold in the shed, it was better to not be in the house where they were. So I saw the pandemic, I think like all of us do, through a keyhole, right? Felt it both as a global phenomenon and as a very local phenomenon. During the pandemic, I taught, like the rest of us did, teaching aspiring educational administrators, as well as doctoral students, as well as undergrads. I did some administration in my department, so tried to bring faculty together to make important decisions, and also edited the journal Educational Researcher. So I had a view of the field, but all from this little, very chilly shed in the backyard. I think that I like to think about my shed, but I also highlight that positionality because there are 3 things about the US context and the way we experience the pandemic that I think are noteworthy, perhaps distinctive, and I'll need you to reflect on how what I tell you speaks to the Swiss experience. The first is, and I know this is not distinctive, this is something that America, the US shares with Switzerland, is a tradition of educational federalism. The central federal government is not strong in the area of education. Power, decision-making is largely devolved to the states and to local school districts. And that set an important context for the pandemic in the US. Of course, also, American society is highly diverse, racially, ethnically, linguistically, religiously. And in this period, if you've read the paper, you probably know, incredibly politically polarized. And the pandemic was a political phenomenon in the United States in a way that I certainly hope it wasn't here. That was not a pleasant part of the pandemic. An unpleasant experience altogether, but that part was particularly unpleasant. Okay, so let's start. First, the pandemic as a portal. So from my US-centric perspective, it does feel clear to me that the pandemic created the conditions that put us in a place where we are ripe for changes in education. I'll highlight 3 of those conditions. The first is the most obvious. The pandemic abruptly stopped business as usual in schools around the world. In some ways, I feel like the COVID turned the institution of education inside out, right? It locked schoolhouse doors. It sent educational leaders and educators into a desperate search for strategies to keep students engaged and learning from the relative safety of their own homes. For those of us lucky enough to live in places where broadband infrastructure was strong, that meant that we were using Zoom screens as stand-ins for classrooms, learning management systems as stand-ins for bulletin boards, and syllabi, text messages as stand-ins for parent-teacher conferences. In much of the US, we spent a year or even more in that remote-only state, only returning to person slowly, tentatively, amidst the increasingly hostile political environment in the spring and even in the fall of 2021. Second, the pandemic created new challenges for schools and for the young people we educate that are still reverberating. So I consider it a great blessing that young people were largely spared COVID's worst health consequences. In the US, we had fewer than 2,000 confirmed COVID mortalities among people under 18. But it's been disastrous for young people in other ways. To begin with, the pandemic has clearly impacted young people's mental health. There's a lively debate about why this might be. Was it isolation? Was it social media? Was it just staring into the face of all that death and illness and fear? And the answer, of course, is probably all of the above. What's important, though, is that emergency visits for mental health crises were up 20 to 30% in the early lockdown months of the pandemic compared to the same period in 2019. Nearly half of US teens report feeling sad or hopeless in 2021. 20% report suicidal thoughts. Parents and teachers, mental health professionals across the US at least, are ringing alarm bells about this crisis in youth mental health. As this graph illustrates, the pandemic didn't single-handedly create this mental health crisis. Suicidality was rising in advance of the pandemic. It was also coming down from a low or from a high a couple decades before. So it's not a unicausal story, but clearly our children are suffering in the wake of the pandemic. In the face of that suffering, it seems perverse to worry about students' standardized test scores, but here, too, we see loss, serious loss. This picture comes from a really wonderful study by Bastian Bethauser, Anders Bach-Mortensen, and Per Engzel, in which they assemble test scores from test score data from middle-income and high-income countries around the world. And what they show is that, on average, kids lost something like a third of an academic year in achievement over the course of the pandemic. Those losses appear to be more pronounced in math compared to reading and language arts. They're more pronounced in early grades compared to later. They're more pronounced among students from lower socioeconomic backgrounds than their more affluent peers. And in middle-income contexts compared to higher-income contexts. So the upshot is that our students' academic achievement lagged considerably, and there's some evidence that achievement inequalities have widened. In the US, we just released the long-term NAEP scores, and the conversation around this learning lag has taken turn to discuss a sort of lost 30 to 50 years of advances in educational, in our educational system. Our test scores are down in a way that they haven't been since the 1970s. And of course, it's not just the students who suffered. So this picture, and I could have shown this picture from many states, but it showed up in the journal that I edited, so I like it. This picture represents turnover for teachers in Massachusetts public schools, and on the right, on your left, you'll see a picture for new teachers in particular. Sorry, your right. The rate of leaving the profession increased by 20% in the state of Massachusetts in the wake of the pandemic, increased by nearly 50% for new teachers. This turnover wouldn't necessarily be a problem if the pipeline to the teaching profession was strong, but that's not the case, at least not in the United States. Schools are struggling to hire educators. They're struggling to retain educators, particularly in crucial fields like special education and mathematics. It's not all bad news in the US context. There is a bright spot. In the US, where, as I mentioned, we have a long-standing tradition of funding and operating schools at the local level, the federal government hasn't traditionally been a major player in school finance. But when the pandemic hit, that changed, at least temporarily. Between March 2020 and March 2021, the US Congress authorized some $191 billion in supplemental educational funds. Those were administered in 3 rounds of the Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief Program. We call it ESSER in the US. ESSER worked very much like a big federal program often works in the US context. The federal government sent money to the states. State departments of education then distributed that money based on plans to districts, to local education authorities, based on plans that they wrote and articulated. To contextualize this sum of money, because you talk about billions and it could be 30, it could be 300, it's a lot, right? To contextualize that, in the US in 2019, the year before the pandemic, we spent, from all governmental sources, local, state, and federal, $800 billion on education. So this is an enormous infusion of funds. The first round of these funds, the smallest round of ESSER funds, were spent on the emergency, right? They were spent on buying laptops, hotspots. This was before the days of PPE even. It was really spent on just securing the resources to educate students from home. But the last 2 rounds, and particularly the third round, have the potential to be more transformational because they're being spent with the goal, largely, of digging us out of these the 2 challenges I mentioned. So here's a picture of spending to date in this third round. As the graph illustrates, most of this money is being spent on learning recovery, extended school days, summer tutoring programs, new curricula. Other buckets of funds are being include money for teacher bonuses and other perks that are designed to address staffing challenges. The program's design arguably limits its capacity to drive educational change because the money needs to be spent now and it's not recurring. We talk in the US about a fiscal cliff that schools are going to face in a couple of years when this money is gone and they're going to figure out how to keep running the programs they've started. But it's an enormous infusion of cash, and it's provided schools and school leaders with some space to reflect on their priorities. So, if I were to approach this like a TV detective, do you have Colombo in Switzerland? I hope so. I hope for your case you do. I'd say the pandemic created all of the elements for educational change. We have opportunity, a total disruption in business as usual. We have motive, unprecedented challenges to be met, and we have means, an infusion of resources. Of course, this isn't a murder mystery. We're actually asking whether there's a body rather than solving the crime. And so it's a harder case to crack. To answer the question of how or if the pandemic is changing education, but what Colombo tells us is that there's certainly the space for educational change. To answer the question of how it might or may not, we need a theory, and we need contextual knowledge. We need a sociologist of education. So the second story I want to tell you about the pandemic the pandemic and its consequences, and the pandemic and educational change draws on sociological theory. I think this theory is helpful because it provides an opportunity to define some terms. What's a school? What is this thing that we call education? What does it mean for schools and education broadly to change? What are big changes and what are small changes? But it's also a little frustrating as I sort of thought about this by digging into sociological theory, because the theories that I know in the sociology of education are really strongest on stability rather than change. And so that's why I call this section of the talk, The Pandemic as a Pothole. So let's start. Let's start with the school. So what is a school? My definition for the purposes of this talk is a school is a social organization in which a diverse group of people come together with a shared set of understandings and expectations in order to enact a series of routines related to learning and youth development. That's a little bit of a mouthful, but what I want us to realize is a school is not a place, right? A school is much more a collection of roles. It's a script. It's a dance that we enact and we reenact as we come together in schools or online to do school. Schools don't exist alone, right? They exist in relation to other schools. Those relationships between schools are complex. Sometimes schools compete with one another for resources or students. Sometimes they pass students from one to another. Sometimes they share knowledge and practices. Sociologists call these connections, these relationships among organizations, an institution, the institution of education. The institution represents the broad, loose social organization, the shared understandings that we carry with us when we ask ourselves, is what we're doing right now schooling? Is this education? The institution of education, in turn, exists in relation to a host of other social institutions. The family, the state, so the family, the state, the marketplace or the labor force, science. I could have and I should have, because we'll talk a little bit about religion later, talk about religion as another social institution. I think sociology provides three main ways to think, let's go back to this picture for a second, the three main ways to think about how these parts relate to one another. Each of these big theories provides some cautious hypotheses about how a disruption of COVID-19 might or might not change schools and education more broadly. So the first of those theories that I want to draw upon is social reproduction. Social reproduction is a story about why education systems, despite their broad and vocal commitments to equality and equality of opportunity, we think of ourselves as educators as egalitarians and as in the act of doing egalitarian work. But social reproduction points out that our work often serves to reproduce existing social inequalities, and it asks why and how that happens. So The discipline, or the theoretical perspective of social reproduction starts with two big observations. First, the people who do well in school tend to do well in life. They earn more money, they gain more power, they hold more prestige than students who do less well in school. And second, there's a strong and persistent, incredibly persistent association or link between a student's background, who their parents are, the neighborhood they came from, and particularly their parents' education, and their chances of educational success. So what's this mean for thinking about how the pandemic might be changing education as an institution? Social reproduction theory throws a little cold water on Arundhati Roy's pandemic as a portal optimism. The social reproductionists will tell you that educational change is possible, but we will tend to enact systemic changes that retain existing inequalities, or indeed even broaden existing inequalities. This is central to the way that social scientists, at least in the US, think about education and society, so much so that in the winter of 2020, a couple of my colleagues fielded a survey of US-based educational researchers asking them to predict the pandemic's consequences for socioeconomic inequality in achievement. The responses they received, some 250 responses, varied, but the median prediction held that the well-documented socioeconomic achievement gaps in US schools would have increased by 25 to 30% between 2019 and 2021. This is remarkable to me for two reasons. The first is, remember, in December 2020, we had no idea what we were in for, right? We thought we had been through it, but the pandemic had much more in store for us and for our schools. But secondly, even though we were making those predictions from a place where we tended to be overly optimistic about the way the pandemic would play out, the predictions are actually a bit more pessimistic about what happens to educational inequality than the research is showing. We see widening inequality, not quite the magnitude that educational scholars predicted, that US-based educational scholars predicted. Our frame, from social reproduction, tells us that changes will tend to reproduce or even widen existing social inequalities, and our prediction is that COVID is no exception. The second sociological theory I want to tell you about and think about its implications for COVID-19 in schools is institutionalism. So as the name suggests, institutionalism draws our attention to the action within the institution of education. Institutionalists see education as a sort of keystone institution in contemporary global societies. Education often drives what happens in the family. In the institutionalist account, education creates the conditions under which science has legitimacy in our society. Education creates the citizens that make up the liberal democratic state. So in this story, education is really at the heart of the world that we live in. And because of that, and the reason education has this power in the institutionalist telling is that education has the ability to legitimate. It legitimates inequality, it legitimates knowledge, it puts an imprimatur, it puts a stamp that carries a sheen that tells us what matters, tells us how to think about things, and makes what is feel right. That's the story of institutionalism. As a result, institutionalists argue, education is often relatively insulated from the demands of other important social institutions. So my go-to example of this sort of insulation, this buffering in institutional theory, is a story that the sociologist Amy Binder tells about how in the 1990s, when Christian conservatives organized to take over school boards across the United States in order to mandate instruction in intelligent design, which is a kind of fancied up creationist alternative to evolution. In several places, this conservative movement claimed majorities in school boards passing laws, buying textbooks, and creating educational standards that mandated the instruction in intelligent design. But what happened in the classrooms? Binder shows pretty convincingly, not much. Why? Because teachers, biology teachers, didn't teach the intelligent design. They were buffered from these institutional pressures, and they did what they wanted to do. The other side of that, though, is that institutionalism argues that education's power limits the ability of individual schools or individual teachers and the people who work and live and learn and work in those schools from deviating substantially from the fields, the institution's norms. Institutionalists use the phrase institutional isomorphism to describe this sort of inward pressure, this, I'm going to get it wrong, so I'm not going to tell you whether it's inward pressure to describe this phenomenon. And the argument is that we must enact, we carry around with us a grammar of schooling, and we must enact that grammar of schooling day after day, a teacher, a classroom, those roles, the teacher, the student difference, the textbook as a kind of canon, testing as a mechanism to assess students' learning and to reward credentials, to reward students' progress. That grammar of schooling is impervious to change. We can't individually deviate from it, because to do so is to risk the legitimacy upon which education operates. So to imagine what this all means to go back to our story about COVID, I like to imagine a teacher who, like the character in the American short story Rip Van Winkle, somehow falls asleep on March 1st, 2020, and luckily enough skips those intervening 3 years, wakes up on March 1st, 2023. So imagine this teacher, Mr. or Ms. Van Winkle, getting out of bed, stretching, getting his beard under control or her hair lined up, commuting to school, walking down the hallway, and going into his or her classroom. And when I think about this, when I do this little thought experiment, I imagine that the teacher wouldn't see much changes, right? It's been 3 years, there may be someone new in the principal's office, the signs on the walls might be a little bit different. The kids with masks, which might bother him a little bit, but some of them aren't going to be wearing masks, that's going to be a little confusing. But more or less, he's going to confront, or she is going to confront an institution that looked a lot like the institution that predated the pandemic, right? The students are still sitting in their desks. They're still expecting the teacher to control the classroom. They're looking for a syllabus. They're looking for assignments. The norms and expectations are largely unchanged. So the institutionalists tell us that those structures, the grammar of schooling, are largely fixed, and it's what happens in the classroom that can change, right? That can mutate. Those changes come at a smaller level, and they come less formally. Rip Van Winkle would have been out of step, I believe, with the other teachers in the school in 2023 if she came back and enacted all the same routines that she did in 2020. But she wouldn't have known it because from her egg crate perspective of the classroom, she wouldn't be able to see the way those teachers did that work. So institutionalism is predicting little structural change and the informal diffusion of changes in practice. All right, one last theory, I promise. The last sociological or social science theory I want to tell you about is I'm going to call accountability. And in truth, it's more than a theory that comes to us from economics, but it's infused thinking and policymaking in the United States enormously. So incentives and rational choice infuse the logic of accountability. In this view of the world, humans are wired to minimize costs and maximize benefits. From an educator's perspective, that often means sticking with the tried and true, right? Because change is risky, change is hard, it takes effort, right? So according to accountability theory, it takes an incentive, a carrot, a stick, or maybe even better, both a carrot and a stick, to drive educational change, to induce schools to reorganize, and find better, new, more equitable ways to educate. So this is where the state comes in accountability theory. If institutionalism is a theory about how educational and institutional power buffers educators from environmental pressures, accountability is a theory about how the state can penetrate that buffer by articulating educational goals and setting up rewards for schools and educators that meet those goals and punishments for schools and educators that fail to meet those goals. So what's this have to do with the pandemic? Well, remember in the US, the federal government started flooding schools with resources, $192 billion in emergency resources beginning in spring 2020. If we were to tie those resources to clear expectations and thoughtfully aligned incentives, an accountability theorist would tell you we have the recipe for educational transformation. Unfortunately, and I hear this when I talk to bureaucrats and to researchers in the US perspective, unfortunately, they'll tell me, we didn't do that in the US. The federal investment around COVID came with virtually no strings attached. So I recently met with a senior leader at the US Department of Education who just bewailed this fact and said that these emergency COVID funds represented a huge missed opportunity for our nation, an invitation for fraud and waste. Oh, did I do something bad? No, we're good. So the theory is that in a moment like this, when the state is getting involved in education and throwing resources around, we have the potential for change, but only when the incentives are aligned. Changes will align with incentives or their lack thereof. Oh, sorry, I'm not quite ready to do that. So what we have here are three very different theories. They draw on different understandings of human motivation and the way the social world works. But I think for our context, they actually make predictions about how COVID changed education that are complementary, or at least not mutually exclusive. Social reproduction holding that changes are possible, but they'll tend to reproduce or widen existing social inequalities. Institutionalism predicting little change, at least in structure, at least at the institution level, while changes in practice may diffuse more informally. And accountability looking for the way incentives drive those changes. I think there's wisdom in each of these theoretical traditions, but it's important to note that they each are making predictions about central tendencies, right? About what happens on average across a society. And I think as such, they can lead us to overlook variation that underlies those generalizations. And it seems to me that variation is one of the defining characteristics of an age of disasters, which I think we're living in, and of the way COVID is playing out through our society and in our schools. So this is what I talk about, this is what I mean when I talk about the pandemic as a pool cue. Back in the spring of 2020, when I was mulling Arundhati Roy's analogy of the pandemic of the portal, I remember thinking about how remarkable it felt to go through a truly global crisis. And it was, I think it is, COVID was a global crisis. But I'm also, in retrospect, struck by how differently that crisis played out, both across and within societies. Some of this variation is related to existing social inequalities, as the reproductionists would remind us. So I think about the difference between the way professional families lived through the pandemic. They hunkered down in their homes to stay safe, to learn and work remotely. I think about how differently that is from some of my children's classrooms whose parents needed to show up at Amazon and work in the warehouse, or even show up at the grocery store, risking exposure and leaving their children to sort of fend for themselves as they did remote school. Other forms of variation in the way that we experience the pandemic map to community preferences and to politics. So in the US, some communities locked down in the face of the pandemic. They stuck with remote school well into 2021, when people were suited up with vaccines, when we were comfortable with testing routines, when we had plenty of KN95s. That's the America that I lived through the pandemic in, but it's certainly not the only one. That America, by the way, is only now coming out of the pandemic crouch. I'm still surprised when I go to a place and don't see any masks as I do in this room. So it's still a different feeling in sort of what we call blue America, in kind of progressive corners of the United States. But that's just a part of the experience. Elsewhere in the US, pretty early on, people decided to deny that the pandemic existed, or to consider it with the president at the time a Chinese hoax. And they hurried back to business as usual, as early as fall 2020. People died for this understanding of the pandemic. It was important to the way they lived their life. To visualize how that variation is playing out in education, I want to take a closer look at pandemic learning loss for third graders, so these are 8-year-olds, 9-year-olds, in my home state of North Carolina. So this picture doesn't take that deeper dive, it just sort of sets the stage. What we have here on the left are trends in the proportion of third graders who test proficient or higher in 2018 and 2019. We have no data. These tests are administered in the spring of every school year, and we didn't test in 2020, so we have no data in 2020. We come back to testing in 2021 and 22. On the left, we look at math, and on the right, we look at English language arts. And what you see, consistent with Betthauser, Bach-Mortensen, and Engel's more global findings, consistent with the literature, any place in the world where this research is being done, we see evidence of severe learning loss for North Carolina public school kids. The decline in math proficiency from 65% in 2018-19 to 44% in 2020-21 is, I estimate, equivalent to the loss of nearly a full year of learning based on average annual gains from 3rd to 4th grade in math on nationally normed tests. Also consistent with the global evidence, the data from North Carolina public schools suggests that pandemic year declines in reading are less pronounced, but by no means trivial. In both areas, we see some evidence of recovery from the pandemic setback. By spring 2020, North Carolina third graders appear to have made up nearly half of their pandemic declines in math in particular. But when we zoom in and look how these trends played out across North Carolina's more than 1,000 elementary schools, you can see what I mean when I talk about the pandemic acting as a pool cue. So to help you understand that, in this picture, I've drawn, this is a scatter plot that each of those dots is an elementary school. On the y-axis, these are well, let me tell you what it is, and then I'll situate it on the map, on the graph. It's a scatter plot of student performance in the 2 years leading up to the pandemic. So on the y-axis, we look at the proportion of third graders who were proficient in math in 2019, and on the x-axis, we look at the proportion of third graders who were proficient in 2018. If a school did exactly as it had year after year, those schools would line up on the red line, right? They would line up on that diagonal red line. And they very nearly do. The correlation here is like 0.85. So there's some dispersion. Some schools have a good year and then take a step back. Some schools have a bad year and take a step forward. But what you see is a cloud of performance, a strong year after year correlation in student performance. So what happened in 2021? The pandemic came along, and it was a pool cue. It knocked schools down, right? But it didn't knock them down universally. It also spread them out. So here we have percent proficient in 2019, the y-axis from the last graph on the x, and percent proficient in 2021 on the y-axis. If in 2021 schools did exactly as they had in 2019, if nothing had happened, you would expect those schools to cluster around the diagonal as they had the previous year. But of course, that's not at all the case. Schools fall back enormously. To take an example, Hillendale Elementary. Do I have a pointer? No. Oh, I did a bad thing. I should have tested this beforehand. It's okay, though, because I think I can just do this. All right, so I don't have a pointer, but Hillendale Elementary, which is just up the road from my house in Durham, North Carolina, in 2018-19, about half of third graders scored proficient or higher on math and reading. By 2021, just 15% were scoring proficient in math and 25% in reading. So Hillendale's in that, it's in that cluster, way down below the line. Fast forward to spring 2022, and you can see that math scores are creeping back up toward the red line, back toward the diagonal, as educators and learners across the state begin to make up for the pandemic setback. But I think the most notable thing that you see is that, well, not the most notable thing, a notable thing, an encouraging thing, is that snapback seems to be the most pronounced among the schools at the bottom of the distribution. The schools that really fell out are reverting to the mean. This is good news for inequality, obviously. Hillendale is again illustrative of this trend. By 2022, its math and reading proficiency rates were up from 15% to close to 35%. So not back to where they were before the pandemic, but they were moving toward that way. But what I really want to draw your attention to is that spread, that dispersion that we saw in the post-pandemic year is still here. And so to put a number on it, if we have a 0.85 correlation in school proficiency year after year in the pre-pandemic years, we now have a 0.65 correlation, far more dispersion between schools and performance. So line these together so you can sort of see the picture. So what this visualization really reinforces to me is that it's a mistake to think of the pandemic's impact on schools as a single or a singular phenomenon. The big takeaway from this visualization, I think, is that the pandemic had very different impacts on different schools. In some schools, things are heading back toward normal, at least as measured by third grade math proficiency rates. In others, they're persistently lagging. Further analyses that I've been doing as I try to understand this is frustrating because this variation, this lasting variation, is hard to explain. In a typical pre-pandemic year, student achievement patterns would follow social inequalities with predictable regularity. High poverty schools, schools that educate large proportions of racially and ethnically marginalized students, would by and large lag behind more affluent and whiter schools. This generalization still holds. Again, the social reproductionists have a point, but those sort of social structural predictors, the social inequality predictors, explain far less of the variance in the post-pandemic era than they did in the pre-pandemic era. A new factor that didn't seem to matter much before the pandemic now explains variation. There's a lot of variation that's happening at the local level, at the district level. Educational trajectories are clustering at the community level in a way that they never had before. I don't yet have a strong explanation for this emerging pattern, but I think it bears watching because it points to a sort of balkanization in educational experiences, so between schools, but especially between communities. And so it makes me think, as we go back to the institutionalists, that the pandemic's local pressures have weakened education's tendency toward institutional isomorphism. I wonder if we're entering into a period in which education is less a single global institution and more a diffuse local prerogative, something that we debate over and enact in our own ways in our own places. So, as I start to wrap up, I want to tell you about 3 places where I think this trend toward localism is playing out. Technology, efforts to attend to student well-being, and education in the US context at least, in particular, educational privatization. So technology is an obvious place to start. This picture doesn't look like much, but to me it tells a huge part of the pandemic's story from a K-12 educator's perspective. What we see here is a bunch of pallets stacked with Chromebooks in an American public schools school districts receiving warehouse. So rush orders of pallets like these started shipping out to school districts across the US in spring 2020. ESSER funds accelerated those shipments as districts used their money to buy laptops for students, to outfit classrooms with cameras and other digital learning tools, to license Canvas and other learning management platforms, and invest in digital curricula and all the rest. 1 year later, in the spring of 2021, Education Week surveyed educational leaders about their digital learning device provision, and the responses speak to the magnitude of this change. Before the pandemic, fewer than half of surveyed educational leaders reported they provided one device per student at the elementary school level. By 2021, that was at nearly 85%. Similarly, one-to-one device provision in the middle and high school level jumped from 2/3 to 90%, nearly universal in just a year. So how is all this technology changing educational practice? To answer this question, I started talking to kids. And the kids I talked to, many of them report that their teachers are using technology extensively in the classroom, even after the return to in-person instruction. They say their teachers are using technology for course organization. They're using, although some of the time, what they talk about changes that feel like minor innovations on the longstanding grammar of schooling. So you replace a paper syllabus with a course web page. You do assignments on Google Docs rather than having students hand them in. You replace a bound textbook with a digital edition. But in other cases, I hear about a more fundamental turn toward web-enabled learning. So I have a 16-year-old, high school junior, and in the course of the last year, he's researched battles in state legislatures across the United States around voting rights in a government class, using internet news aggregators. He's used Google Docs to engage in peer editing exercises in an English composition class. He's made video essays about local habitats for an environmental science course. These strike me as promising. Pedagogical innovations, really meaningful changes to educational practice, but I don't know how typical they are, or even really if the word typical is appropriate in this domain. I also recently talked to someone who works in the North Carolina State Department of Education, whose job is to help coordinate technology, digital learning, across the state's schools. And she's pulling her hair out, and she says the single most widely used tool for professional learning around digital technology in the state of North Carolina is social media. Her feeling is that there are no best practices, there are no norms, there are no agreements about how technology should be used. Teachers are learning from one another, which is great, but they're learning from one another piecemeal, in closed communities in idiosyncratic ways, driving dispersion and variation in the way the technology is being used. I have a feeling that this is going to continue to define the way technology is used in K-12 schooling. The story around student well-being is similar, I suspect. If you look at the messages that school district superintendents and principals conveyed to their teachers and their students and their families in the early days of the pandemic, you see a lot of similarity. They were framing the pandemic as a threat to student health, as a threat to student well-being. But as the pandemic politicized in the United States and as time passed, those messages that framing started to diffuse. And today, those messages either emphasize student well-being or emphasize student learning loss. It's one or the other. I think this variation it reflects some disagreement around the priority that educators are placing on student well-being, but also reflects variation in the strategies that they're employing to address the mental health challenges that I mentioned. In the US context, a big part of this, again, is a lack of resources. We lack staff. We lack the funds to hire staff around student well-being. As of January 2023, just one US state, Utah, employed enough school psychologists to meet the National Association of School Psychologists recommended one psychologist per 500 student ratio. 31 states were staffed at half that ratio. I could put a picture of school counselor staffing rates, and it would look very much the same. Classroom teachers, I think, are often stepping into this void. They're building time into their day to check in on students, to teach socio-emotional skills, and to look after their kids in a more holistic way. But they vary substantially in their interest, in their willingness, in their training to engage with these questions around youth mental health. And so this is another place where I think institutional isomorphism is giving way, and we're starting to see widening heterogeneity in educational practice. I know teachers and leaders who are calling for the implementation of new school schedules in which students spend 4 days in traditional school and spend the 5th day, sort of a Wellness Wednesday it's often called, on their own in wellness activities. Spokane, Washington is taking this approach. It's cutting back on face-to-face instruction with the goal of helping schools and students improve their mental health. On the other hand, I know teachers and school leaders that are doing the exact opposite and trying to build in more school time, more structured school time, more face-to-face instruction with the idea that it protects students from the threats to their mental health around home that come from their homes and their families. Dallas, Texas, for example, schools are adding 21 instructional days to their year. So broad variation. I attribute some of the post-pandemic variation around technological change and responses to concerns about student well-being to a post-pandemic rise in school choice and educational privatization. Between the 2019-20 and 21-22 academic years, enrollment in US public schools declined by 1.3 million students. Some of what's happening is that kids are moving out of public schools and into private schools and home schools. Private school enrollment's up by 4% across the US since fall 2019. Homeschool enrollment's up 30%. That's a big deal in a country where historically 90% or more of students have attended public schools. And homeschooling in particular has until recently been a sort of niche, kind of oddball activity. This shift's likely to continue in the years ahead. In North Carolina, conservative state legislatures have been passing legislation that uses state funds to support private and religious schools, increasingly realizing Milton Friedman's 1960-era libertarian vision of a school system in which parents are empowered to act as consumers, sending their students, their children, and the public educational funds associated with those children to the schools of their choice in a crowded educational marketplace. For Friedman, this sort of public school voucher system was exactly an attempt to break up institutional isomorphism and create economic pressures for schools to innovate and differentiate and specialize in order to attract students and market share. So I think privatization is driving dispersion, but also, that sort of movement from public schools to private schools is a part of the story because another thing that's going on that's remarkable to me is that hundreds of thousands of students, of young people in the United States aren't showing up at school at all. This is most pronounced among kindergartners, where families are deciding just to keep their kids home, not to enact a curriculum, just to keep their kids at home. But something a little like it is happening at other grade levels where chronic absenteeism is dramatically up. A quarter of US high school students have missed more than a month of school in the last academic year. I think this is remarkable because my view until recently of education has been that it's a global, compulsory experience, right? An experience that virtually every young person in the world experiences. It feels to me like that institution's globalness and its kind of coherence is changing. So to think about what those changes mean, let's go back to this picture of the institution of education and the institutions that it interacts with. I think we're seeing three big changes in the US context. The first is that pressures toward isomorphism are weakening, and I represented that here by taking those schools out of a core in the middle of the field and spreading them out to the edges. The second is that education's institutional power to buffer demands from external forces is also weakening. So I represented that here. Oh, you don't see them well, but with arrows connecting education. I'm sorry, the weakening I represent with a dashed line around the field. And then the third thing is that we're seeing two neighboring institutions growing influence in school, in education, the family, and the new one I added to the picture, religion. So let's step back, and knowing that I'm standing between us and a reception, I want to be quick or brief in my recap with some key and tentative thoughts about the implications of all of this thinking for our work, for educational researchers, and for educators. I'm looking forward to talking about these ideas, which are, I emphasize, tentative, as the week goes on. So over the last hour, I've told you 3 stories about the pandemic and educational change. I've told you about how how the pandemic acted as a portal, creating the conditions for educational change, for institutional change in education. I've also drawn on sociological theory to talk about the social pressures and institutional inertia that resist that change. And I've put forward a supposition, a guess, that the reality may be that education is diffusing and that schools are changing, that the pandemic is acting as a pool cue. If this is right, I think that has a few kind of thoughts, or some kind of. I don't know exactly how these shake out, actually, from the story I've told you, so don't hold me to these. But one thing is that I think that although the pandemic is clearly wrapping up, I picked a bad time to give this talk because the story that I'm trying to tell is still underway. Or maybe it's a good time because we are trying to understand our world as it's changing. The pandemic's effects on education are, I think, ongoing and likely just beginning. The reason it might be a good time to give this talk is that I think this disruption enables agency. As the institution, as education diffuses, as the institution weakens, local sense-making processes, local strategizing matters enormously. We have power in our schools and our communities to make choices about education that I think are far more sweeping than the power we would have had 5 years ago or 10 years ago. And thirdly, I think that it's clear that this rising variation sets the stage for increasing inequality. And I'm afraid that that's what's going to happen. But I think at this point, it's important to say that that is not necessarily the case, because at the local level, we are making choices, and we are strategizing about how to enact schooling. So I think that this leaves us in an interesting place as educators and as educational leaders and as educational scholars. I think that if it's true that the institution of education is weakening, our institutional authority, the doctors next to our name, the professors next to our name, that too is weakening. When the institution weakens, the authority the institution conveys upon us also weakens. But as the institution weakens, the opportunity for changes at the local level get bigger. So school by school, big decisions are being made. Big meeting decisions are being made. And stakeholders at the school level are anxious, I think, eager for advice and guidance. They're as lost as we are, and they're looking for ways through the woods. I think to the point of communicating research, I think this is a time for building trust. I think it's a time for humility. I think it's a time for engaging in dialogue with practice. I think that sort of posture of humility can get us to a place where we can solve the problems, these sort of unprecedented, unexpected problems that we find ourselves in today. And so I just said humility, and I'm going to end with a pitch to a new book that I just released. So much for humility. But that book, which was written largely before the pandemic and just came out this last week, ends with, that I wrote with my colleagues and friends Andrew Penner and Emily Penner, ends with a discussion of how educators can engage, educators and educational leaders and educational researchers can really rethink the practices that build inequality in their schools. Because it comes from the insight that education is a script that we enact over and over again. And so as players on that stage, we have the power to change, in improvisational ways, to change the ways we enact that script. I think the point, I guess, that I want to make is exactly that we remake our social order interaction by interaction and day by day. I think that's always true, and I think it's especially true in a time of disruption, like the time we're living through. So if we approach that work with curiosity, with conviction, with creativity, with courage, and I think I'm going to say it again, with humility, I think we're in a place, we have an opportunity to make schools and systems that work better for all youth. So, thank you.